North Atlantic. Somewhere beneath grey skies and heaving swells, a United States carrier group is at battle stations, not for war, but for a NATO exercise designed to prove something the Americans already believe, that their carrier defenses are among the best in the world. The escorts include some of the most advanced anti-submarine warships in NATO. The sonar systems are state-of-the-art. The operators are experienced and confident. They sweep the water in every direction. Nothing. No contact. The carrier is secure. Then a periscope breaks the surface. Close. Dangerously close. The exercise controller's voice comes over the circuit. The carrier has been successfully engaged. Torpedoes away. Strike complete. In the exercise, one of NATO's most powerful warships has been hunted, stalked, and defeated, and nobody detected the submarine before it reached firing position. The submarine responsible isn't American. It isn't British. It isn't Soviet. It flies the Maple Leaf. How did a relatively small Canadian submarine force become so difficult to detect that it repeatedly reached firing positions against heavily defended aircraft carriers? And why has almost no one ever heard this story? To understand what Canada's submarines became, you first have to understand the world they were built to fight in. The year is 1960. The Cold War is not an abstraction. It is a daily operational reality measured in nautical miles, ocean temperatures, and the constant hunt for submarines beneath the North Atlantic. The Soviet Union's Northern Fleet is expanding rapidly, becoming one of NATO's primary Cold War concerns. From their bases on the Kola Peninsula, deep inside the Arctic, carved into granite coastline, Soviet submarines are putting to sea in numbers that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. NATO planners feared Soviet submarines could threaten the vital sea lines connecting North America and Western Europe in the event of war. One of the most important routes Soviet submarines would have to cross was the GI-UK Gap, one of the Cold War's most important maritime choke points. By the early 1960s, the Royal Canadian Navy understands the assignment. Canada has a distinguished naval heritage forged in the Second World War, when the RCN escorted convoys across the North Atlantic and developed anti-submarine expertise that helped tip the Battle of the Atlantic. That institutional knowledge has not disappeared. It has evolved. But convoy escort destroyers and maritime patrol aircraft can only do so much. To truly hunt Soviet submarines, to get ahead of them, to track them in the deep water where they hide, to understand how they think and where they move, Canada needs submarines of its own. The decision is made. Canada will establish a permanent submarine service. Between 1965 and 1968, 3 Oberon-class submarines enter service with the Royal Canadian Navy. Their names are drawn from indigenous nations: Ojibwa, Onondaga, Okanagan. Their crews are small, their funding modest, their mandate enormous. Canadian sailors quickly give them a simple nickname: the O-boats. What few observers yet realized was that these 3 submarines were about to earn a reputation far beyond their size and numbers. The O-boats are British in origin, built in Britain for export and Royal Navy service. The Oberon-class was among the finest conventional submarine designs of the post-war era, fielded by the Royal Navy and exported to a handful of trusted allies. Canada operated 3. Other Oberon-class submarines also served with navies including those of Australia and Brazil. On paper, they are comparable boats, drawing from the same blueprint. In practice, Canada's 3 will become something different entirely. The foundation of that difference is propulsion. The Oberon-class is diesel-electric, a design philosophy that the nuclear age had begun to dismiss as outdated, but which carried a decisive tactical advantage that many naval planners underestimated. A nuclear submarine is never completely silent. Its reactor and supporting systems must continue operating, even when the boat is moving slowly. A diesel-electric submarine running solely on batteries can be exceptionally quiet. Canada takes this inherent advantage and sharpens it deliberately. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the O-boats receive extensive upgrades that make them among the most capable conventional submarines in Canadian service. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Canada modernizes the boats with the Subtix Combat System, a combat management platform that gives the O-boats a data processing and fire control capability well beyond their original design. The boats are eventually equipped with Mk-48 heavyweight torpedoes, significantly improving their combat capability. Sonar systems improve. Sensors begin working together in ways they never had before. Every system feeds into a clearer, faster, more lethal tactical picture. But hardware alone does not explain what the O-boats become. Canadian submarine crews are relatively small, typically numbering around 60 to 70 sailors, and they train relentlessly. The culture inside Maritime Command's submarine service develops a quiet, almost monastic intensity. These are not men who broadcast their capabilities. They spend extended deployments beneath the surface, learning the North Atlantic the way a hunter learns terrain. They know its currents, its depths, and the acoustic shadows where submarines could disappear. In the water, they were proving far more difficult to detect than many larger navies expected. The O-boats don't announce themselves. That is the point. From their base in Halifax, Canada's submarines deploy regularly into the North Atlantic on Cold War patrols, many details of which remain poorly documented publicly. What is known comes from declassified operational records, from retired submariners who have spoken carefully over the years, and from the NATO documentation that has gradually filtered into the public domain. What it describes is a submarine force doing exactly what it was built to do, in conditions that would test any navy on Earth. The North Atlantic in winter is unforgiving. Water temperatures plunge. Storms roll in off the Labrador Sea with sustained winds that make surface travel brutal and disorienting. But depth is a different world. Below the thermocline, the invisible boundary where cold and warm water meet and sound bends and scatters, the O-boats find their element. They run quietly on battery power for extended periods, their diesel engines silent, their crews moving through the boat in near darkness to reduce the faintest mechanical vibration. A submarine patrol is not combat. It is something more psychologically demanding than combat because it offers no release. Weeks pass. Depth and silence become the entire world. The crew of fewer than 70 men exists in a sealed steel cylinder, hundreds of feet beneath a surface they cannot see, tracking contacts that may or may not be real, in a war that has never officially started and may never officially end. The mission at its core is intelligence, locating and tracking Soviet submarine activity in the North Atlantic, track them without being detected, record their acoustic signatures, the unique sound fingerprint of each vessel's propeller, machinery and hull, and feed that data back to NATO command. In doing this, the O-boats are operating at one of NATO's most important intelligence frontiers. Former Canadian submariners have described in interviews the experience of sitting silent, running on battery, as a Soviet nuclear submarine passes within detection range, close enough to hear through the hull. Not metaphorically, literally. The low, rhythmic pulse of another vessel's machinery, transmitted through the water, through the steel, into the boat. The order to hold position, hold depth, make no sound, let it pass. This is what these men did, year after year, decade after decade. And within NATO, the results accumulate quietly in briefing rooms and exercise after action reports. The O-boats develop a reputation for effective tracking and surveillance operations. They are maintaining contact in acoustic conditions that challenge other anti-submarine assets. They are penetrating defensive networks that many planners considered exceptionally difficult to breach. Allied commanders begin to take notice. The Canadian boats are producing results that attract increasing attention across NATO. American ASW officers reviewing exercise data begin paying close attention to Canadian submarine performance. The O-boats built a reputation for remaining exceptionally difficult to detect, and soon, some of NATO's most capable anti-submarine forces would discover just how difficult. The setting is a NATO fleet exercise somewhere in the North Atlantic, the kind of large-scale operational rehearsal the alliance runs to test its readiness, stress its procedures, and identify weaknesses before an actual war forces the lesson. The United States Navy has brought a carrier battle group centered on a large aircraft carrier, its flight deck laden with aircraft, around it a ring of escorts, destroyers, frigates, and at least one nuclear-powered attack submarine running in a protective screen. The sonar coverage is layered, overlapping and technically formidable. The group is operating at battle tempo. Its ASW crews are not running through the motions. They are working the problem, actively hunting for any submarine that might attempt an approach. Somewhere beyond detection range, a Canadian O-boat goes deep. It does not rush. Rushing makes noise. Instead, the crew works the ocean, reading the thermocline layers, finding the acoustic shadow zones where sound bends away rather than travels toward the carrier group's sonar arrays. During the final stages of the approach, the diesel engines are shut down. The batteries power the electric motors at extremely low speed, minimizing the submarine's acoustic signature. The approach takes hours. The range closes. The fire control solution builds. Target course, speed, depth, bearing. The exercise rules are clear. Reach firing position, hold it, and call the shot. The exercise controller receives the signal. Torpedoes away. The carrier has been successfully engaged. Accounts from retired submariners and naval historians indicate that this was not an isolated result. Canadian O-boats repeatedly penetrated carrier battle group defenses during NATO exercises, an achievement that left American anti-submarine warfare specialists taking the results very seriously. The tactical explanation is relatively straightforward. Modern nuclear submarines are extremely quiet, but diesel-electric submarines running solely on batteries can sometimes be even harder to detect under specific conditions. In those conditions, the acoustic advantage reverses. Reactor support systems, coolant pumps, and auxiliary machinery can all contribute to a detectable acoustic signature that a patient operator in the right position can identify and track. Running on batteries at low speed, the O-boat presents an exceptionally small acoustic signature. American after-action reviews, according to accounts that have emerged over the years, describe the Canadian submarines with genuine respect. Canada's O-boats, at the peak of their operational capability in the late 1970s and 1980s, were not merely adequate NATO participants. They earned a reputation as some of the most effective conventional submarines operating within NATO. Many Canadians have come to believe that some of the country's most impressive defense projects are often abandoned before their full potential is realized. The Cold War ends in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolves. For many policymakers, the primary threat that had justified decades of military spending appears to have diminished dramatically. And in Ottawa, the calculators come out. Canada's defense budget, already restrained through much of the Cold War, enters a period of cuts so severe they reshaped the entire structure of the Canadian forces. The Chrétien government's 1994 Defence White Paper reflected a period of significant defence reductions across the Canadian forces. Program after program is reduced, consolidated or cancelled. The armed forces contract. The Navy shrinks. The O-boats, now approaching 30 years of service, require investment to remain operational. Their systems need maintenance. Their hulls need attention. Keeping a submarine force credible is not cheap, and in the mid-1990s, cheap is the only option the government is willing to consider. The men who served on these boats understand what is coming before the announcement arrives. Career submariners watch the signals, the budget lines, the staff studies, the silence from naval headquarters when questions are asked. They have spent their careers reading what is beneath the surface. They recognize the signs immediately. HMCS Ojibwa is paid off in May 1998. HMCS Okanagan follows that September. HMCS Onondaga, the last of the three, is decommissioned in 2000. With her retirement, Canada's Oberon era comes to an end. The transition to a replacement submarine force proves slower and more difficult than expected. The institutional knowledge held inside that small, intensely trained community of Canadian submariners begins to scatter. Retired officers, dispersed crews, expertise that took a generation to build and cannot simply be reconstituted on demand. The government frames the decision as responsible fiscal management. The boats are old. The Cold War is over. The threat has changed. What the government does not say, what it perhaps does not fully understand, is that submarine capability is not a light switch. You do not turn it off for a decade and turn it back on. Skills, procedures, and operational experience can be difficult to rebuild once lost. The tactics do not pause. The institutional memory that makes the difference between a capable submarine force and an expensive liability walks out the door with the last generation of O-boat crews. Canada had built something extraordinary, and then, with the practiced indifference of a bureaucracy managing a spreadsheet, it walked away. The replacement Canada eventually chose was not a new beginning. It was a warning, and the warning came written in fire. In 1998, Canada announces it has found a solution. The British Royal Navy is retiring its Upholder-class submarines, 4 boats barely a decade old, representing a generation of technology newer than the O-boats Canada just decommissioned. The acquisition is structured as a lease-to-purchase agreement, announced at roughly $750 million Canadian dollars. The Canadian government presents the deal as a cost-effective way to preserve a submarine capability. Within a few years, the deal would become one of the most controversial defense purchases in modern Canadian history. The 4 submarines, renamed HMCS Victoria, Windsor, Corner Brook, and Chicoutimi, transfer to Canadian control. but they do not transfer operational. They have been in extended storage in Britain, their systems degraded, their maintenance deferred. Reactivating them proves far more complex and expensive than the original assessment suggested. Canada's submarine service now faces a difficult and prolonged transition period. The years pass. The submarines cycle through lengthy refits. Costs mount. Schedules slip. At various points through the early 2000s, Canada experiences periods when submarine availability is severely limited. The nation whose submariners had earned a respected reputation within NATO now struggles to maintain continuous operational availability. Then, on October 5, 2004, HMCS Okanagan is making her delivery voyage from Britain to Canada, her first crossing under Canadian operation. Seawater enters through open bridge hatches during severe weather conditions. The water contacts live electrical equipment. Fire breaks out in the forward section of the boat. Lieutenant Chris Saunders, a 32-year-old combat systems engineer from St. John, New Brunswick, goes into the smoke to help his crew. He does not come back out. He dies of smoke inhalation. 9 other crew members are injured. The submarine is towed, crippled to safety. Okanagan does not return to operational service for years. Lieutenant Saunders' death became one of the most tragic events associated with Canada's submarine transition, and remains a defining moment in the history of the Victoria-class program. 3 submarines, fewer than 70 men each, a budget far smaller than that of the world's major naval powers, and yet, for 3 decades in the coldest, most unforgiving waters on Earth, Canada's O-boats earned a reputation for achieving results that larger navies respected. They found the enemy, they stayed with the enemy, and in exercise after exercise, they demonstrated an ability to penetrate the defences of some of NATO's most heavily protected warships, then surfaced to a silence that spoke louder than any commendation. This is the Canadian story that never makes the textbooks, not the apology, not the accommodation, not the careful, diplomatic middle-power optics that Canada has spent generations curating on the world stage. This is the other Canada, the one that builds something extraordinary in the cold and the dark, without asking for recognition, and then performs at a level that stuns everyone who witnesses it. The O-boats were not an accident. They were the product of strategic vision, engineering commitment, and a generation of sailors who chose a hard life in a silent service because they believed it mattered. It mattered. And the pattern that ended them, the same pattern many Canadians associate with the Avro Arrow, HMCS Bonaventure and Bras d'Or, is, for many observers, a pattern that seems to repeat itself. Canada keeps building world-class capability. Canada keeps walking away from it. 3 boats, silent, invisible, and lethal. They spent 3 decades operating in the North Atlantic and earned a reputation for reaching firing positions against warships many believed were well protected, and then disappeared beneath the surface one final time. Nobody saw them go.